Hello, my name is Terry Braswell with Terry Braswell Ministries. We're privileged today to meet with Dr. Gerald Harris, editor of the Christian Index of the Georgia Baptist Mission Board. Christian Index is the oldest religious newspaper in the United States and is one of the oldest newspapers in the country, having been started in 1822. Dr. Harris will be one of our preachers for our Preaching with Power conference to be held on September the 15th at the Cornerstone Baptist Church in Lithia Springs. For more information about our conference and for additional resources, we encourage you to visit our website, terrybraswellministries.com. Dr. Harris, thank you for being with us today.
It's my pleasure, Brother Terry. I'm always delighted to see you and happy to be a part of the Bible conference that I am anticipating with great joy.
Oh, we're looking forward to it very much. Dr. Harris, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your background? Where are you from?
Well, I'm a hillbilly from North Carolina. I was born in Hickory, North Carolina, grew up in the small town of Valdez, which has a very interesting history because it was established by Waldensians who came from northern Italy, who were followers of Peter Waldo, who was a part of the Protestant Reformation. And there's still some very strong believers there who established a Presbyterian church when they got to Valdez. But anyway, that's my hometown. Went to elementary school, finished high school there, lived there until I went to college.
And where did you do that?
Well, I went to Mercer University and majored in English literature and minored in history. And following graduating from Mercer University, I took unto myself a wife. Her name was Martha Jean Maxwell. She was a member of First Baptist Church of Noonan, and she was attending what was then called the Women's College of Georgia. So we were married shortly after my graduation from Mercer, and we went together to Southeastern Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina, in order for me to continue my education and prepare for the ministry.
And you have children and grandchildren?
We do have 3 children. We have a daughter who is married to our pastor. In fact, we're members of Ephesus Baptist Church, just west of Douglasville, and they have 3 children. Then we have twin sons that are 3 years younger than our daughter, and our son Jerry has 4 children, and our son John has 3 children.
Well, I'm glad. I wanted to get that in.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Tell us about becoming a Christian. How old were you when you accepted Christ?
Well, I was almost 10 years of age. I grew up in a Christian home. My grandfather was my first pastor, and my Aunt Mary asked me one day, have you thought about giving your heart to the Lord? And I had thought about that, but I kind of put that on the shelf and didn't think about it too much for several weeks until one week I was playing in the backyard with my cousin Francis. We were playing Cowboys and Indians. We decided to build us a campfire, and it was in the fall of the year, and the wind swept that fire across the meadow and burned down my uncle's chicken house. And I covered up that sin for a while because I didn't want to admit that I was responsible for that fire. But the next Sunday, the pastor happened to preach on bearing false witness, and I got under deep conviction. And I'd been able to hide that sin from my folks, but at least I thought I had. My mother knew all along. She just waited for me to confess it. But I broke down at the Sunday dinner table and told my parents that I had sinned and set the fields on fire. And told my dad I was under conviction that morning in church and I'd like to talk to the pastor. So he made an appointment for me to see the pastor that afternoon. And it was on that afternoon visit with the pastor that I prayed and asked Jesus to come into my heart.
How far after that before you felt the call to ministry?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I was very much involved in the Royal Ambassador program in our church. And when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I went to Fruitland Baptist Assembly, which is now Fruitland Bible Institute. And we had an RA camp there every year. And I heard a missionary by the name of John Compton from Brazil. He had played football at the University of Alabama, so I was just fascinated by him for several reasons. Because he was a missionary and because he was a former college football player. And it was at that time that I felt that the Lord was calling me into some kind of ministry, so I surrendered as an adolescent to full-time ministry. But it was not until I was a senior in high school that I knew that God was calling me to be a preacher of the gospel and a pastor.
How long did you pastor?
Well, I pastored for 41 years before I became the editor of the Christian Index, and that was a struggle for me. And I called several people whom I had respected through the years, because Romans 11:29 was a problem for me, which says the gifts and the calling of God are without repentance. And I knew that God had called me to be a pastor and a preacher, and I felt that if I were to become a newspaper editor, that I would be forsaking that call. But the people that I called included Adrian Rogers and Paige Patterson, people that I respected very much. And each person told me that I would not be forsaking the call, but because I'd still have the opportunity to preach, and I would also still have the opportunity to pastor, but my flock would now become fellow pastors rather than a congregation of people. And so that has proven to be absolutely true. I'm always surprised when I get invited somewhere to preach, though, but I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
Amen. That's a difficult transition to make from pastor to a position like editor. I understand that.
Well, there are some things that I really miss about the pastorate, and more than anything else, I miss the ordinances. Because, you know, when you are the editor of a paper, you don't get to baptize people who come to faith in Christ, and you don't get to observe the Lord's Supper. In fact, the first 3 or 4 years I was the editor of the Christian Index, I did not observe the Lord's Supper one time in about 4 years. Because when you're invited to preach for someone else, they don't invite you to come and administer the Lord's Supper in their church. And I was not in our church at a time when the Lord's Supper was provided, so I really miss that. And the first time that I observed the Lord's Supper after about 4 years, I was an emotional basket case, because the elements and their meaning became so real to me. It was just a tremendous spiritual experience.
Let's talk about preaching. You've been doing it quite a while. Tell us a little bit about your preparation. How do you look forward to your sermons? It's a little different now, I would assume, from preaching as a pastor and the preparation for that, and then as preaching in the itinerant kind of lifestyle.
It's a whole lot easier to prepare one sermon every 3 weeks than 3 sermons every 1 week. But I still enjoy preaching, and I still enjoy preparing sermons. In fact, this morning before I came here, I was working on a sermon on Psalm 51, and it was a tremendous experience. I was even brought under conviction as I was preparing a message about David's great confession. But I love to preach. I love to preach expository sermons. I'm almost a slave to alliteration, which is probably not the best thing in the world, but it certainly helps me to remember my points better if I'm doing that. So what I typically do is ask God to give me a subject that I feel that I need to address or that I should address. And the reason I'm preaching on Psalm 51 is because I'm afraid that we live in a society today that is so tolerant of sin that people aren't sensitive to their sins anymore, because everything is tolerated. And we live in a society today where if you, for example, if you embrace same-sex marriage, if you embrace, well, I was going to say homosexual, same-sex marriage or abortion or lewd behavior or any of those things, you're considered loving. But at the same time, if you embrace absolute truth and religious liberty and traditional family values, you're considered to be bigoted. And so I just felt like we needed to understand the importance of confessing sin, understanding what sin is and confessing it, because those who confess their sins will have mercy and forgiveness. Those who don't will be judged. So I landed on that topic after a good deal of prayer, and then was directed to Psalm 51. And once I did that, I studied the psalm and read it numerous times and developed me an outline for that psalm. And then I read some commentaries to find out what some of the great scholars and preachers of the past have said about that passage. Once I got my outline and my theological background for the points that I wanted to make, I began to look for quotes and illustrations that I could use to put some meat on those bones. So that's kind of how I do it.
Now, as a pastor, did you preach through books of the Bible? Did you do themes, or how did you approach preaching to your congregation?
In the beginning, I did that almost exclusively, but I found out, in fact, this summer I will have been preaching 60 years. So I was called to my first church in 1960, though, even though I was preaching some as a teenager. And in the early 60s, people came to church. People won Sunday school pens because of perfect attendance. And on Sunday morning, you could preach through books of the Bible, and 75% of the people would be there for the whole series. That's not true anymore. So at Eastside, I would preach through books of the Bible on Wednesday night and on Sunday night, but on Sunday morning, I would take shorter passages of Scripture. For example, I preached a series on the 23rd Psalm. I preached a series on the Lord's Prayer. I preached a series on Jude, which is a short book in the Bible. I preached a series on the Beatitudes. So I took shorter series rather than preaching through a whole book on Sunday morning.
Well, you've always done a good job when I've listened to you, Dr. Harris. You know that. And, we appreciate it.
I'm still learning how to do it.
Dr. Harris, over the years, who has been those men who have influenced you in your preaching and perhaps even your pastoral leadership?
When I was at Southeastern Seminary, I had come actually through 4 years of very liberal teaching at Mercer, and I was in Southeastern at the time when they were probably very liberal in their theology. So I was starving for good, solid, conservative theology and good, solid, conservative preaching. And it was wonderful that during that period of time in the early 60s and mid-60s, that the North Carolina evangelism conferences were a source of great encouragement to me. And every year they would have both Stephen Olford and Vance Havner. And I feasted upon their preaching. And Stephen Olford became one of my heroes. He was pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in New York City at the time. And he would publish in transcript form his sermons. And I subscribed to those sermons and read them with great interest and appreciation. And of course, he was a great expository preacher. Billy Graham called him the greatest expository preacher of the 20th century. So he had a great influence on my life. And when I was the pastor of Peachtree Corners Baptist Church, I had the privilege of having him come and preach in our church. And Martha Jean and I had he and his wife Heather in our home for a meal. And that was just one of the highlights of my pastoral ministry. Also, Adrian Rogers has been a tremendous inspiration to me. When I was at Jackson, Mississippi, I would go up to Memphis occasionally. My wife and I would go to Memphis to see her uncle and his wife. And we got to where we'd go on Thursdays, and I'd go at noon to his men's Bible conference, that he had a luncheon for men on Thursday. And he got to realize that I was there probably once every 6 or 8 weeks. And he invited me to come and not eat lunch there, but to wait until after they'd had lunch, and he and I would have lunch in his study. And we did that on several occasions, and I got to love and appreciate him. I have a tremendous respect for Adrian Rogers and for his preaching as well, and for the wisdom and the leadership and the mentorship that he has had for so many preachers.
Well, those are pretty influential individuals to be associated with. That's the past.
Yeah.
What about currently? Who do you see that catches your attention doing these younger preachers and such?
I think one of the finest preachers, younger preachers in our day, is Anthony George, who's the associate pastor at First Baptist Church in Atlanta. I've known Anthony since he was a student at Braswell College. In fact, I was a trustee there back in the 80s, and Anthony was the president of the student body. But he is a powerful preacher. And he preaches at First Baptist Atlanta more than Dr. Stanley does. He preaches every Wednesday night, and he preaches about half the time, or more than half the time, on Sunday morning. I noticed that the next 2 months he's preaching 6 out of the 9 Sundays on Sunday morning. And he is a very powerful preacher. And of course, I think we've got some great young preachers here in our state. I really think Brad Waters is a great preacher. I think Mike Stone is a great preacher. I think Terry Trivet, who was in our state and now in Alabama, was a great preacher. And I've just preached with him on several Bible conferences, so I have a tremendous amount of admiration for them, and think that because of them and because of young men like your son, we still are going to have great preaching on into the future.
Times are changing, Dr. Harris. How do you see the trends and the influence of those trends currently and in the future?
Well, I'm going to be real personal with you at this point, because I had never known anything but expository preaching like Adrian Rogers, Jerry Vines, Stephen Olford did. But when I came to Eastside Baptist Church in Marietta, the staff greeted me and said, "Now, what's going to be your target audience?" And I didn't even understand the question. I said, we're going after everybody. What do you mean, target audience? And they said, well, we think it would be good to target the age group between 18 and 40. And I said, well, that's good, and we can certainly go after those people, but I don't want to target any one group over another. And then they said, well, how do you feel about felt needs preaching? And what do you feel about seeker-sensitive sermons? And I said, well, I'm not all that familiar with felt needs preaching and seeker-sensitive sermons. I just preach the Bible and let the chips fall where they may. And there were some people on the staff that were resistant to that kind of preaching. But I think in our society today, in some areas, we have a lot of that going on. It's a kind of a consumerism mentality. You try to please the people that come rather than address hard biblical subjects in their presence. So I don't feel comfortable with that wave of preaching that I believe is becoming more and more predominant in some areas. So that is really a great concern to me.
Dr. Harris, we really appreciate you participating in our conference. Would you address the conference and your feelings toward this?
Well, I was honored to be a part of the conference last year and very thankful that you invited me to come back. You know, it's good to get an invitation one time. When you get two, that's pretty special. But you know, I think it's good to have preaching conferences today. They were probably much more popular 15, 20, maybe 50 years ago than they are today. But I think we still need those kinds of conferences. And I think there is a hunger for those conferences in the hearts and minds of some people. I've been a part of several conferences that have been going on for multiple years. I've had the privilege of preaching in Bailey Smith's Real Evangelism Conference probably 8 or 10 times. And in Wayne Robertson's conference down in Valdosta, I think now 18 years in a row. And it takes time to build a conference because the best way to do it is by word of mouth. And if people go one year and they're blessed, they will speak well of it, and more people will come the next year, and that repeats itself over and over again. So I want to commend you for doing that, and I pray that the people who go to your website or hear information about the conference will come, because I think they will be blessed and their lives will be enriched as a result of it.
Well, I think we've got a good lineup. Pastor Ben Lang will be preaching, as well as Herman Parker, pastor of First Baptist Church Bremen. And then in the evening, in our evening session, you'll be preaching along with Dr. Robert Smith from Beeson School of Divinity. We'll begin at 2 o'clock with a fellow of Terry Braswell Ministries starting the program. But we're going to be excited about that, and I think we're going to have some great preaching that's going to take place that day.
Well, you've got two great black preachers, and then some preachers who wish they could preach like black preachers.
Amen. Thank you again for being with us tonight.
Well, you're welcome. Great to be with you, Brother Terry.
God bless you. Well, we sure do appreciate you letting us talk with you today. And we're looking forward to our preaching conference in September. And we want to encourage you again to join us at our preaching conference at Cornerstone Baptist Church in Lithia Springs. And again, I would remind you to check out our website at terrybraswell.com. You'll find more information about our preaching conference, but also we have some other resources that I think you'd be interested in. Thank you again for joining us for this interview.